Hey, welcome to the 8th grade STAR study guide, 7-minute mastery series. Today's topic, slavery. All right, the beginnings of slavery. Indentured servitude was typically a 7-year service. One was required to pay off debt. Usually somebody would get transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Oftentimes these were Europeans. They were deeply in debt for their transportation, had to work off this to gain their freedom. This was practiced for a few decades in the early colonial Americas, but soon slavery was legalized and the transatlantic slave trade was born. This was the buying, selling, and shipping of slaves from Africa to the Americas. Slavery was more common in the South because there were more cash crop farms, mostly tobacco at first, then also rice and indigo, and then eventually cotton. With vast lands and a need for cheap labor to harvest crops for profit, this is what drove the slave trade. The North had more merchants, shipping, and trading, and thus the need for cheap labor was lesser than it was in the South. A not-so-free country, slavery eventually was outlawed in most northern states while it continued to grow in the southern states as cotton became a more profitable crop. With the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, slavery became exponentially more profitable in the South and drove the industry. One thing you need to know is that the invention of the cotton gin actually made it faster to get the little seeds out of the cotton, so they desired more slaves to pick more cotton because now they could produce more sellable cotton. Three-fifths compromise was the decision in 1787 during the Constitutional Convention to count slaves in the southern state populations, or any states for that matter, as 3/5 of a person towards counting the state population. So it took 5 enslaved people to count as 3 normal citizens. The reason this was a compromise decision was because the North did not want the South to have a greater population to help them have more representatives in the House, while the South were not going to allow their slaves to vote. So this was kind of a really disturbing compromise. Dred Scott was a former slave who tried to sue for his rightful freedom in the Supreme Court. Led by Roger Taney, the Supreme Court justice at the time, said a black man was property and thus not a U.S. citizen. And so therefore he could not sue the government because Roger Taney and the Supreme Court decided that these people were not even U.S. citizens and essentially not even humans for that matter. They were only property. It's probably the most disturbing case in all of Supreme Court history. The Dred Scott case. One way I remember that is thinking it would be dreadful to be Dred Scott. Dred Scott case. It was a dreadful decision. So seeking freedom. Abolitionists were just those who wanted to abolish or end or destroy, demolish, abolish slavery. That's an abolitionist. There's 2 Harriets here we're going to learn about, so make sure you know the difference. Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a white woman who wrote the fictional best-selling book called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. It told the darker side of slavery and opened up the eyes of many of the Northerners who really didn't have a clear perspective of slavery. They read this book and it really invigorated the abolitionist movement. The Quakers were a religious group who opposed slavery and often helped with abolitionist movements, including the Underground Railroad. It was a network of abolitionists who helped Harriet Tubman and others rescue slaves to northern free states. The Quakers were a religious group that were abolitionists. The Underground Railroad really wasn't a railroad, and it really wasn't underground, by the way. It was just a network of people's homes and hiding places as slaves that escaped from the South worked their way northward. Harriet Tubman was a former escaped slave who went down into the southern slave states many, many times to help other slaves escape. And this is all part of the abolitionist movement, to abolish slavery or to set free other slaves. So freedom fighters, some controversial figures here. You have John Brown. He was an abolitionist who felt action was more necessary than talking when it came to freeing and the freedom of slaves. He was the white man at the top right here, most infamous for his raid on Harper's Ferry, which was a governmental building that stored weapons. He attacked it, tried to get ammo and weapons to give to slaves in order to start a slave rebellion. That did not work very well. He and his sons were eventually killed. Nat Turner was a slave who escaped and led a rebellion in 1831 in which he and other escaped slaves helped free other slaves, and killed many plantation owners and their families along the way. So there was a lot of turmoil, obviously, surrounding slavery at this time. Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in the Confederate States. We'll talk more about that during the Civil War, but you can't mention freedom fighters without mentioning Abraham Lincoln. It wasn't until the 13th Amendment, however, in 1865, that slaves in all U.S. states were technically and officially freed. All right, let's move to some questions here. As always with these questions, read the question, press pause, then when you've figured out your answer, press play, and let's find out if you're right. Which of the following contributed most to the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade during the 1700s? Press pause. Here's your answer. A demand for slaves in the American colonies that produced cash crops. So the reason the transatlantic slave trade grew, the reason more slaves kept being bought and purchased and brought over here was because people were making money using them growing crops. Transatlantic slave trade, you have a map here. Which of the following was a major reason for the flow of transatlantic slave trade shown on the map? Similar to our previous question, press pause. Here's your answer. Economic demands of the plantation system. That's almost the same question as we just read. Both are previous STAR questions, though. I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years. I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. 1904. Who made this statement? Press pause. Here's your answer. Harriet Tubman. Remember, Harriet Tubman was, and remember this however you need to, the difference between Harriet Beecher Stowe, the white woman who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Harriet Tubman, the black woman who was the leader of the Underground Railroad freeing slaves. All right, you got two newspaper articles up here. It says these headlines refer to the decision in which Supreme Court case Missouri Compromise declared unconstitutional and the triumph of slavery. So this is probably a terrible thing. Let's press pause. Press play when you know your answer. Here's your answer. Dred Scott versus Sanford. Slavery prevailed in that case. Which of the following was an argument made against slavery in the 13 colonies? Press pause. Here's your answer. Quakers argued that slavery violated Christian principles. Remember, Quakers were a religious group that was anti-slavery. Another word for anti-slavery, remember? Abolition or abolitionist. All right, that's all for this lesson. Thanks for participating. As always, watch more of the videos. Take notes. Watch them again. Do what you need to do to where you feel prepared. Thanks again. Bye.